Alright, so this is a 2008 Toyota Matrix. We're just going to do a brake job on this front disc. Pretty basic video. I know a lot of the repair videos that I do are usually more complicated than brakes or whatever, but I don't have too many brake videos, and I think I'm going to start doing a little more of them just for people that have a particular car and they want to learn how to do their own brakes or think about doing their own brakes and want to save some money. So I'll show you how I do the brakes and kind of go through it, do different things. Now I've already did the driver's side on this car, and it was almost, the pads were almost gone. It was almost metal to metal, and you can see here the front rotor, the front of the rotor looks to be in pretty good shape, but when you turn it over, now you're down to it's quite a bit of pitting, and the rotor material is gone. It's down to the straight metal. So we're going to go ahead and replace rotors on this one. And anyway, I'll show you. I'm not going to make this a real long video, but I do think I'm going to start doing more vehicle specific brakes just for people. My channel is mainly people that are trying to learn to do things on their own or save some money or whatever. So we can't always do head gaskets and in-depth repairs. Sometimes we got to do the simple repairs too. So this is just going to be maybe some more of these coming with brakes. I do quite a bit of brakes throughout the week. So anyway, I got a little bit of time today. Figured I'd shoot this one. So I'll get on the passenger side and we'll go through step by step what you need to do, what tools you need to change the pads and possibly the rotor on your Toyota Matrix. Alright, so here we are. First thing you want to do pretty much any brake job is remove your caliper. On the Toyota Matrix, it's a 14 millimeter. So you got two bolts back here. Like I said, I'm keeping this basic, so if you already know how to do a lot of brakes or whatever, this video is probably not for you. But anyway, you want to remove these two bolts back here. This here is my cord to my light. Your car won't have that, so just ignore it. But anyway, here's your caliper right here. You got two bolts. And one thing I will point out, brakes are pretty easy to do. Almost anyone with a little bit of mechanical ability and basic hand tools should be able to do brakes. But at the same time, you want to, if you don't do a lot of them or you're not real familiar with it, take your time and do it right, because it is your brakes. So it's kind of like a double-edged sword. It may be kind of easy for experienced mechanic to do these, but if you make a mistake, it could cost you an accident or something. So take your time if you don't know what you're doing, and make sure that you do it right, and don't try to blast through it or half-ass anything, as they would say. So anyway, I'm going to go ahead and pull this bracket off. 14 millimeter, got two bolts. Of course, you don't need an electric ratchet to do this. Perfectly fine with a regular ratchet or whatever you have. You probably even do it with an open-end wrench if you want to take all day. So you got your two bolts here. So what I do, you don't have to necessarily do this. You can get a bungee cord. Hey, you can get a bungee cord or whatever you want. They do, auto parts stores do sell these. These are caliper hooks, but anything will work. String, anything you have laying around will work. If you plan on doing your brakes a lot or doing other people's brakes, it's not bad to invest in this tool. It's just a simple little, this is an OTC, it's a simple little brake caliper hook. I think they're like 10 or 15 bucks for a set of them. So just pull it off, and you don't want to, I've seen guys who'll just hang this off your brake hose. You really don't want to do that. You don't want to put a bunch of stress on your brake hose and cause issues that you don't have right at the moment. You don't want to cause more work for yourself, that's what I'm trying to say. So I just hook it up, and then I hook it up to the top of one of the coil springs. Kind of gets it out of the way. So once you're out of the way, you can see the pads here. These are really thin. I got a feeling we're going to find more pitting on the back side of this rotor. We went ahead and got two rotors either way. It's always a good idea to change both of them at the same time. Now, if you were just going to do a pad slap and you weren't going to do the rotors or anything, I would still recommend taking this caliper bracket off, pulling your rotor off, and cleaning behind the rotor. Because if you get any kind of rust or any kind of buildup behind this rotor, a lot of times that's what causes your wheel to vibrate coming off the highway or something. People automatically assume it's your rotor, but you would be surprised. A lot of times rust and stuff builds up behind these rotors over time, and will cause, just a minimal amount will cause vibration of the steering wheel. So I always go the extra step. Even if I'm not changing the rotors, I go ahead and take off the calipers and caliper bracket and pull this rotor off and clean it off behind it. I'll kind of show you that. So anyway, I'm going to go ahead and turn the wheel a little bit so I can see more. Now you got two 17mm bolts back here for the bracket. Now if you're just wanting to do a pad slap and just slap some pads on and be done with it, you don't have to take this caliper off, and you don't have any vibration in your wheel, you don't care or whatever. Then you can just pull these pads off now and switch them out, and then compress your caliper and go back to work. But if you want to do it, go a little bit extra mile with it and make sure you don't have any vibrations. And if you're changing the rotors, you have to do this regardless. The stuff I'm getting ready to show you. But anyway, and if you're just going to do a pad slap, maybe fast forward through the video to where I compress the caliper and kind of show you that and put the pads on and everything. But for now, we're going to stick with what we're doing, and that is pull this bracket caliper off. 17mm. I use a stubby impact. Obviously you don't have to have that, but you will need a 17mm socket to get it off, or open it if you want to take all day. Now you pull those two off. Might be a good idea to hold on to the caliper, because it could fall. So once you pull those two off, you can pull this bracket off, and your brake pad should come with it. And you can see here, hopefully, how thin these are. The inside is really thin. Now these are your slides. I'll go over this in a second too. You want to pay attention to these slides. We're going to address this in a little bit. But yeah, the pad's almost metal to metal, and there's quite a bit of material left. There's a big lip around the edge of this rotor. That indicates that this rotor's about done anyway, regardless of if there's any pitting back here or not. I think I do feel some. Anyway, what I do on these rotors, some rotors have little screws in them. A lot of Hondas and stuff have little screws that hold this rotor in there. So check and see. This matrix does not have those screws into the bearing here. So this thing should just pop off. And I know from the other side it's not going to just pop off. Now if you're going to reuse this rotor and just clean out behind it, get yourself a big rubber mallet or something and just beat on it behind here, and it should come off. We're not going to reuse these rotors, so I don't have to use rubber mallet. I can just use a hammer and knock it off. Regardless, normally it's going to be rusted on here. Not all the time, but a lot of times it's just going to be rusted, depending on where you live too, the salt and all that. But the rotor will be rusted on here, and it's kind of a pain to get off. So I'm going to go get a hammer and knock this one off. And like I said, if you're planning on reusing this rotor, then use a rubber mallet or some other way to get it off. Rubber mallet's probably the best, a big one. And since I'm going to not be reusing it, I won't be so nice. I'll just use a regular sledge, mini sledge, and just beat it off. So I'm going to go do that real quick, and then we'll get my hammer, and then I'll be right back, and we'll. Alright, so I went ahead and hit this pretty hard. Took quite a bit of force to get this thing off, and you can see here, here's where I hit it, but you can also see all the pitting where the rotor is going away, and it's down to the bare metal of the rotor. I mean, this is a metal surface, but the actual rotor itself, this part. So this rotor needed to be replaced. I wouldn't be surprised if this is the original rotors on this car. I don't know how many miles are on it, but with the amount of material that's off of this and gone, regardless, these have been on here a super long time. The front, that's why I'm saying you kind of want to take these off no matter what, because the front looks fine. And you may say to yourself, well, my rotors are good. But then you look at the back and you see all this pitting. You see all this pitting, and it's down to the actual rotor part of the rotor. So if that makes sense to you, the actual smooth part is gone. So anyway, this is where we get into if you were going to reuse this rotor. If yours came off pretty easy and the rotor was in good shape, this is the area right here where you'd want to clean out real good. Now I use one of these angle grinder with the 3M disc on it, and I get in here and clean up real good all through here, and I'll get up and I'll clean on the bearing surface. And believe it or not, just a little bit of rust in here can cause all kinds of issues with vibrations to the wheel and stuff. So if you are going to reuse this rotor, go ahead, and if you don't have one of those angle grinders, then get maybe some steel wool or something and just clean it up. Make sure there's no rust in here, and do the best you can if you don't have an angle grinder or 3M or something like that. Even like a drill attachment, you know, a cordless drill attachment with a brush or something, anything just to get the rust out here. So anyway, I'm going to go ahead and we'll throw this out and get the new rotor, and I'll kind of show you what I do with the new rotors. Not a big deal, but alright, before I show you the rotor, I went ahead and used my angle grinder that I showed you earlier with a 3M disc on it, and went ahead and cleaned up this bearing surface here, or the hub surface. This is where the rotor goes on to, and you want this clean of rust and everything also. It's the same thing. If you got rust here or on the rotor, you can get some kind of vibration in your steering wheel. Hey! So anyway, when you get a new rotor, don't just slap it on the car. Usually these manufacturers that make the rotors put like a grease or an oil or a chemical on the rotor. You can use soap and water to clean it off, or brake clean, and they put it all over the rotor surface here to keep it from protect the rotor and keep it from rusting, you know, while it's on the shelf, transport and all that. So they're normally wrapped in plastic, and then it has like a film on them. You can kind of see the film if you look at it and turn it sideways. So anyway, they usually recommend soap and water. I use brake clean and a towel and just clean it off, and never had a problem with it. So once you get it all cleaned up, go ahead and slide it on there, and then now we'll address the caliper bracket. The caliper bracket is here. You got the pads. We'll go ahead and slide these off. You can see they're pretty worn. This inside is really worn. Now, one thing I will point out about these calipers is very important is these slides here. These are your slides. This is what your caliper slides back and forth on. If these do not move freely, you have to get them free. Otherwise, you will cause uneven brake wear and all kinds of other issues. So if you can't take this slide and move it in and out easily, then you're going to have to address it. Normally, if I get one that's stuck, I'll put a little heat down here away from this boot, because if you put it right out, you know, obviously you put it up here, you'll catch the boot on fire. But normally, if I put a little heat down here, put this in the vise, put a little heat down here, then put a pair of vice grips or something like that on here, you can usually work it loose. Now, if it's that rusty where it's seized in here, then you're going to want to, I use a brush on a drill and get down in here and bore this hole out and clean it out real good. You have to do that, otherwise normally your inside pad will wear much faster than your outside and cause all kinds of issues. So these have to be, and what we do here, these are both moving freely, so that's good. So what we do here is, and then if you can't get these out, if they're seized in and you just can't do it, you can go and buy a caliper bracket. They do sell these normally separate, and if you get it out, your pin's rusty, but you can get this clean, they do sell the pins. So there's options out there. So just grab a hold of the boot and pull the pin out. You don't want to rip the pin, or rip the boot, I mean. And normally, like, these are pretty clean, so I think all I have to do on these is just wipe them off with a towel real good. If you get some that are rusty, even just a light coat of rust, I would buff them off. I use my buff off wheel on my grinder. If you don't have something like that, then get some steel wool or something like that and just clean them up by hand. But you need to get these clean. These need to slide back and forth freely, or you will have uneven pad wear and other issues. So I'm going to go ahead and clean these up a little bit, and then we'll lube them up. And I'll go over the lube and the stuff that I use next, and then we'll start putting this thing back together. Alright, so I got these cleaned up now. Just wipe them off. They're basically in very good shape, so there's no reason to put them in a buff wheel or anything. So once you get them cleaned up and wiped off, get yourself, I don't know if you can read this anymore, I don't know if I can read it anymore. This is caliper grease. This is a big bottle of it because I do brakes several times a week normally, but if you only do it in your car or don't do it very often, they do sell little packets of this stuff. And one of the places you want to use this is in your caliper pins. So this one comes with a brush. If you get the little packets, you'll probably have to use your hand or whatever, but just brush it down real well. You want to make sure these have plenty of lube. You don't want these things seizing up in there. I know some guys actually use anti-seize. I just use this brake caliper grease stuff. And once you get them lubed up, go ahead and slide them back in and make sure that the boot is up around it. This boot protects the rust and all that good stuff, well, the water and all that good stuff from getting in there and rust forming. So once you get it in there, just make sure this boot goes around the pin. Again, I know this is just basic information, but like I said before, this is for beginners. So now we got this. Now I get O'Reilly's ceramic pads. They're the Brake Best Select, and the ones I get, I try to get the OE equivalent pad. You can cheap out and get the organic or the semi-metallic. I wouldn't for the extra money. You know, it depends on. You might be able to get organics for like 20 bucks. Normally, I get the Brake Best Selector between 40 and 60 bucks, and I've never had a customer come back and complain about brake noise or anything. The ceramic, and like I said, I try to get the OE ceramic. I mean, not all cars have ceramic, come with ceramic, but if they do, I try to get, because O'Reilly's has different brands of the Brake Select ceramic. They have the I guess the lower level, and then the OE. So I try to get the OE, and most of the time they come with this brake hardware. So this is the brake hardware here. It's these little plastic or steel shims. If you don't get brake pads that come with that, then you're going to have to clean these up real good and lube them up with that lube that I just showed you. Since my pads come with new ones, I'm just going to pull these off. And the other thing I do is I'll go over to my buffing wheel and I'll buff in through here with it, just to make sure that these seat all the way down and it's nice and clean. Your pad doesn't actually ride on this part, it rides on the actual slides, but I want these to sit down where they're supposed to, so I'm going to go over and buff these out. If you don't have a buffing wheel, just use steel wool or whatever you have laying around, and just kind of clean these up a little bit in these 4 contact points, and then these will sit in there nicer. And once we get the new ones in, we'll lube these up. We'll run a brush across the bottoms here where the pads. You want to run the grease anywhere where the pads slide back and forth. So anyway, I'm going to go clean these up and put the new hardware. Alright, so here it is, the new hardware on it. You can see it's nice and shiny and new. I already put grease on it in all 4 spots. You know, down here where the pad rides. You want to push these down to where they're all the way seated. There's little tabs that keep them from going one way or the other too far. So if you were just doing a pad slap and this was still on the car, you can put the pads on with this on the car. You don't have to take this off, take the pads off. You can just use a screwdriver or your hand and just pull the pads off and then slide the new ones in. If you get the new hardware, make sure you use it. Since we go the extra step, well, we're putting rotors on regardless, but even if I wasn't putting rotors on, I would pull the rotors off and clean behind there, so this would be off either way. It's a good time to put the pads on, so you don't have to get your head under there and look behind there while you're trying to put the pad on. But like I said, you can easily do it with this on the car. It's not a big deal. Just make sure when you put this, if you're doing this, putting the pads on off the car, make sure the pads are going in the right direction and all that good stuff, so you're not putting them on backwards. So anyway, I'm going to go ahead and put the pads on here, and then we'll go ahead and put it on the rotor or back on the car and tighten it up, and then we'll deal with the. Alright, so I went ahead and got the caliper back on, the brakes back on. I still got to tighten it up, but one thing I'll point out before I put this caliper on is these slides do have, they have flat sides and rounded side. You want the flat side to reach into your caliper when you put it back on. If those aren't seated in right, then the caliper won't be on right. Just wanted to point that out real quick before I forget. So now that I got the bracket back on, the pads are on, go ahead and tighten that caliper bracket back. Go ahead and do that real quick. I thought I was. It's two 17mm bolts. Alright. So once you get those tight, back on, go ahead and pull your caliper back down. Now mine slipped around a little bit. And what we want to do now is get an old brake pad and put it up against the piston here. You want to get it up against this piston right here. You can see it's sticking out of the bore. Put your brake pad on there. Now I've seen people use C-clips and things like that, big pair of pliers to get that back. I've actually done it too, C-clamps. You can go to the auto parts store and get this tool. It's pretty. Now this is for a single piston. If you have a dual piston in the front, they sell a tool that has for dual pistons. Most cars are single piston unless you have like a performance car or whatever. So anyway, you're going to set this in there, and this is what's going to push that piston back. That piston comes out of its bore. The more your pads are wore down, the farther that piston comes out, and so you got to push it back all the way to get it back over these new brake pads, because obviously these brake pads are way thicker than the ones that came off of here. You can see this here. Here's the material on this brake pad. It's barely bigger than, it's nothing. And you can see all the meat on this one. So all you do is get the old pad, stick it in the caliper like this, stick the tool in here, and then just turn this. And now this should turn back pretty easily. If you get a piston that doesn't want to push back into the caliper, then you may have a bad caliper or brake hose. You may laugh and say, why would I have a bad brake hose? But those can seize up your brakes just as quick as a caliper can. So I'm not going to go over all that right now. But if this is not pushing back real easy, like this one's pushing back real easy, and you want to push it back all the way till it bottoms out into the caliper, otherwise you probably won't get it back over the brakes. With new brake pads, these got to be pushed back almost all the way on most cars. So if it's not pushing back easy, then you have more problems than you're going to have you're looking at a brake hose or a caliper possibly. So that's all the way in. I can't push anymore. The piston's all the way in there. So now you can just back this off, take it out, throw away your old pad, and go ahead and start putting the caliper back on. Now with it slid all the way, with the bore, piston all the way back in the bore, it should slide on here real easy. And then you want to line up your pins here so that the pin is flush with the inside of this. You can see there's a little, I don't know if you can see on the camera, there's a little kick out right here. You can actually put the bolt in, and this will not be seated all the way, and it won't be right. So you got to turn this pin until it goes into this little indentation here in the caliper. It'll make more sense to you if you're doing yours. And then go ahead and start your bolts back up to your caliper. And if it's seated in right, your pins, you shouldn't have to hold them. If you start screwing this in, you see this thing rotating, then it's not seated right. You got to stop and back this back out and put it in the right spot. So I'm going to go ahead and put these in. These are seated right. And you want these pretty tight. You don't want them coming loose when you're driving down the street. but you also don't want to put a 1/2-inch breaker bar on it either. Just want it nice and snug. So that's pretty much it. That's all there is putting brakes on these cars. Now the only other thing you're going to have to do is when you push that piston in, all your fluid's going to run back towards the master cylinder. So you might see a little bit of brake fluid on the floor or the ground or whatever. That's pretty normal if it's been, you know, if the brakes are pretty worn. Either way, you want to check your brake fluid. After you check your brake fluid, you want to pump up, before you move the car and start driving it, you want to pump the brakes several times, and that'll put the pressure back over to here and get your brakes you know, pumped up to where they should be. If you just put the wheel on and try to drive off, you won't have brakes. You know, it'll go to the floor and you'll be in trouble. So make sure, very important, I've seen a lot of people make that mistake, and you know, bad things happen. So once you get this back on, both sides are back on, go ahead and pump up your brakes. The other thing I'll point out, I know most people wouldn't do this, but if say you're doing both sides at a time, so you have both wheels off and you're going to just go back and forth and do it, you know, both sides at a time. When you're pushing this piston back on, say, one side or the other, you have to make sure that the other side is either on the rotor or it's blocked off in some way, because if you push this back and the other caliper's off, 9 times out of 10 you'll push that piston right out of the bore and you'll need a caliper for it. So that's probably not something most people would do. Try to do it both at a time, but just in case, I just wanted to mention that. So anyway, it's just kind of a basic outline of doing your own brakes at home on Toyota Matrix. You know, I know some of these shops around here will try to tell you need calipers and rotors and hoses, and it's going to be $169 special, and by the time you're done, it's a $700 job. You just use common sense to look over your hoses. If there's no tears or if the installation looks good, they're fine. Your calipers, if they push back and you're not having any kind of pulling issue or anything when you're driving, then they're probably fine. And the rotors, just, you know, if you don't have a micrometer, check it, just look it over, make sure that there's still plenty of meat on it, make sure that both sides are smooth. I highly recommend pulling off your rotors, even if you're not going to replace them, and cleaning behind them, and then you know, just put it back together and take your time, pump it up, and you're good to go. Save yourself some money. So hopefully you enjoyed this video. Hopefully I'll see you on the next one. Have a good day, and God bless.